The end of civilization would seem to be at hand. Pope Benedict XV, Abdication 1914. This is Chapter 5, Obadiah, Obey. This is my summary of Absolute Power by Paul Collins. To begin with, the Serb terrorist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Franz Ferdinand and his wife in the 28th of June 1914. This was the start of the First World War. Austria-Hungary declared war on Bosnia, Germany was Austria's ally, and Russia came to defend Orthodox Serbians of Bosnia. Germany declared war on Russia, bringing France into war since it was Russia's ally, and Germany invaded neutral Belgium, bringing Britain into the war. The Ottomans joined the Central Powers later, and the United States and Italy would join the Triple Entente. The conclave met on the 31st of August 1914. Della Chiesa of Pisa became Benedict XV on the 3rd of September 1914. John F. Pollard described him as the best mix of curio diplomatic and pastoral experience, suited especially to the Great War. Abdication. On the 1st of November 1914, Pope Benedict XV wrote the encyclical which rejected integralism or anti-modernism, since the Catholic Church could no longer reject the modern world. It states that there is room for different theological views in the absence of any authoritative intervention of the Apostolic See, and it also blamed class warfare, race hatred, abandonment of Christian principles, materialism, anti-clericalism, and liberal individualism as causes of the war. Benedict XV removed Mary de Waal, Secretary of State, and Benini, but Benini's secret movement continued to survive. Cardinal Pietro Gasparri became the new Secretary of State, who helped to codify canon law. In World War I, the papacy maintained a policy of neutrality, whereby God was on neither side, with millions of Catholics living on both sides of the war. French Republicans called the Pope Pebusch, or German Pope, and the Germans called the Pope Französischer Papst, French Pope. The Roman question, the papacy was also powerless, since it had no official status, existing in diplomatic limbo. It relied on its historical, moral, and religious prestige. The Treaty of London. On the 26th of April 1915, Britain secretly negotiated with Italian Prime Minister Antonio Salandra to join the war. The Pope helped to trace missing persons and prisoners of war. He encouraged the healing of the sick in Switzerland and engaged in prisoner exchange. He also defended the rights of prisoners, civilians, and arranged truces and aided relief work. The Pope spoke out for Christians in the Middle East like the Armenians and the Jews in Russian Poland. Peace Note, August 1917. The Pope proposed the 7-point plan, which included the ceasing of fighting, the reducing of armaments, creating a system of international arbitration, freedom of navigation, the elimination of reparations, and the return of occupied territory, as well as the negotiations to stop conflict. The peace note failed to deliver peace, as individuals such as Prime Minister David Lloyd George of the United Kingdom desired for the outright defeat of Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II sought an armistice on Ludendorff's behest, ending the war, and subsequent Treaty of Versailles on Germany, which would set the stage for the subsequent rise of Hitler. Save the Children Fund. The influenza epidemic was spreading, and this caused Eglantine Jebb to found the organization Save the Children Fund in 1919 to take care of sick children. In the encyclical Annus Iam Plenus, on the 1st of December 1920, the Pope mentioned the Save the Children Fund twice, praising it for its works in collecting food, clothing, and money to help the sick children. Irish Independence 1916, the Easter Rising. Initially, most Irish bishops gave little support except John Hagan of the Pontifical Irish College, who supported it. The Lloyd government wanted to crush the Irish Republican Army. Mary de Waal, the British minister, Count de Salles, and English Curial Cardinal Aidan Gasquet sided with the Lloyd government in condemning violence perpetrated by the IRA, and they desired a papal condemnation. The Irish-Australian Archbishop Patrick Clune of Perth convinced the Pope that signing a condemnation would be a disaster for the Church. Archbishop Daniel Mannix of Melbourne convinced the Pope to write to the Irish bishops on the 27th of April 1921 that the Holy See is in sympathy for the Irish people, is critical of all violence, but denounces the violence of the police auxiliary of the Blacks and Tans, and the papacy donated 200,000 lire to Ireland. The letter came about in the nick of time as English public opinion was changing, and the truce was signed on the 11th of July 1921. The Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed by the 6th of December 1921, but the treaty, however, led straight to civil war in Ireland. Treaty of Surveyors, August 1920. Ottoman territory was carved into independent Armenia, British protectorates of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, and the French protectorates of Lebanon and Syria. The papacy was concerned with accessibility to holy sites, which the protectorates assured that they were as good as the Ottomans. Zionism. The Pope believed that the Belfour Declaration in 1917 of British support for the Jewish homeland may lead to the expelling of Christians. Plus, the papacy had associated Zionism with Bolshevism, which Paul Collins claimed was a kind of Catholic acceptance of anti-Semitism. Back in Italy, Partito Popolare Italiano, or the PPI, was established in 1918 by a Sicilian priest named Luigi Sturzo. It was a populist party that promoted Catholic social teaching and was left-leaning, supported strikes, trade unions, women's rights to vote, etc. Sturzo was subsequently excommunicated, and he discussed with Secretary Gaspari, who didn't want the political party to be tied to the church. On the 16th of November 1919, Catholics were given the freedom to vote since the Pope lifted the decree of non-expedite. Holy See diplomacy. 24 papal nuncios were sent overseas, which culminated in relations with 27 states in 1922. Apostolic delegates were sent to nations that didn't exchange delegates, such as Australia, the United States, and Canada. In pastoral matters, canon law codification was finally finished in 1917, which led to an emphasis on judiciary and centralization of the Roman Curia and papal control. The apostolic letter Maximum Illud on the 30th of September 1919 emphasized the development of indigenous clergy and religious orders, since they are familiar with their own culture, which can enhance missionary work. Catholicism in China. Matteo Ricci, a Jesuit who evangelized in China in 1582, was accused by Dominicans and Franciscans of allowing a synthesis of Catholicism with Chinese/Confucian customs and wanted Latin customs to trump them. The Yongzhen Emperor expelled all Catholic missions in 1724. Christianity finally returned to China through the dominance of foreign powers, and French missionaries looked down on the Chinese, delegating native priests to lesser roles. Father Frederick Vincent Lebay was a Belgian Vincentian missionary who took on a Chinese name, spoke, dressed, and published newspapers in Chinese, and he read the Confucian classics, which allowed for dialogue with the intellectuals. This inspired priests to repeal the imposition of Latin customs. Pope Benedict XV responded in Maxim Illud about the Chinese church, believing that the Chinese would see Christianity as a foreign religion, and sided with Lebay. Resistance continued to Chinese acceptance in the hierarchy until 1926, when the first 6 Chinese bishops were appointed. Eastern Orthodoxy. Pope Benedict XV wanted to repair the relationship and desired a reunion between the Orthodox and the Catholic Church, which had been in schism for almost 900 years up to that point. The Pope established the Congregation for the Oriental Churches to administer non-Latin churches and Pontifical Oriental Institutes to study Eastern language, customs, and traditions. Spiritus Paracletus, 1920. The Pope wrote this encyclical to celebrate St. Jerome's study of Scripture, in it being divinely inspired, historical, and the Pope used this to condemn the idea that the scriptures were bound in a cultural context. The death of Pope Benedict XV, the 22nd of January 1922. Age 67, Pope Benedict XV died of pneumonia caused by bronchitis. He encouraged missions, opted for peace, and gave generously, restoring the prestige of the papacy. By the 2nd of February 1922, a conclave was held, and Mary the Val negotiated with Cardinal Ambrogio Achille Ratti of Milan to not place Gaspari as Secretary of State. This was breaking conclave rules, as these secret negotiations could have been punished with excommunication, but Ratti, however, rejected the proposal. Ratti became Pius XI on the 6th of February 1922. He was passionate, short, bold, and desired obedience of the church. He also held the first ever Urbi et Orbi blessing, or to the city and to the world, in the front balcony of St. Peter's. In his encyclical Ubi Arcano Dei on the 23rd of December 1922, the Pope wanted to prevent the next Great War and condemn social, legal, theological, and moral modernism. Pius XI emphasized Catholic action, in which the laity is encouraged to participate and assist in the work of the church. Meanwhile, fascism and Mussolini was on the rise. Since in 1919, the proto-fascist, the Anzio, seized the city of Fiume, despite it being given to Yugoslavia by the peace conference after World War I. This was massively popular in Italy and begins the fascist tradition of seizing things, according to Paul Collins. In 1919, there was civil unrest and strikes and indecisive elections in Italy, which led to anarchy. King Victor Emmanuel III asked Benito Mussolini to take power in 1922 to bring back order, even though the fascists were the ones to blame for sowing the seeds of chaos in the first place. The Pope ordered the Sicilian Sturzo to resign from the PPI in 1923 for siding with the godless socialists, which inadvertently killed off Mussolini's competition. Being anti-clerical, Mussolini was called the Magia Prete, or priest eater. However, Mussolini changed his views about the church, learning from Napoleon almost a century prior. He made pro-papist decisions, such as the banning of Freemasonry, clergy were exempt from the draft, and the crucifix was brought back to the courthouse and schoolyard. Pius XI decreed on the 1st of February 1924 that priests cannot be members of political parties or partake in politics. In an encyclical titled Non Abbiamo Bisogno on the 29th of June 1931, the Pope criticized fascism for targeting the young and impressionable and its emphasis on the real pagan worship of the state. The Pope also encouraged the idea of Catholic Action JOC, or Jeunesse du Vieux Chrétien. JOC was founded by Joseph Hagen in 1925, whose organization ran into arguments with the fascist youth movement over religious education and modesty in dress, Conciliazione, Reconciliation, 11th of February 1929. This was an agreement between Mussolini and Gaspari. Part of this agreement included the Lateran Treaty, whereby Italy recognized the Holy See's sovereignty, giving it the area around it, and including St. Peter's Basilica, as well as extraterritorial property like churches, colleges, palaces, and offices around Rome and Castel Gandolfo, or the papal residence. It also ensured postal service, telegram, and rail link, and Catholicism was recognized to be the only state religion, whereby if someone badmouthed the papacy, they would be punished by law. Mussolini also gave 750 million lire and 1 billion lire in shares/bonds that gave compensation for the loss of the papal states. Italy also established the Amministrazione Speciale in June 1929, which administered compensation. Concordat with Italy. This concordat promised freedom of worship, the recognition of marriage as spiritual law, and it also gave Italy the power to change diocese boundaries to conform to state administration. This was the birth of the Vatican City State. Quas Primus, 1925, was an encyclical written by Pope Pius XI to emphasize on Christ's rule over the world associated with the authority of the Roman Church. It introduced the feast of Christ the King and served as the Pope's motto, Christ's peace in Christ's kingdom. Paul Collins stated that it was ironic since in the Gospel of John, chapter 18:36, Jesus says to Pilate that my kingdom is not of this world. Quadragesimo Anno, 1931. This encyclical addressed the Great Depression, and it stated that it was caused by corrupt modern society and individualism. The Pope disliked capitalism and socialism, even in its moderate form, and suggested the return of society to the medieval period. In 1936, the Pope created the Vatican Observatory and the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. He modernized the Vatican Library and founded the Pontifical Institute of Christian Archaeology, and also established the Vatican Radio in 1931, allowing the Pope to influence anyone from any part of the world instantaneously. Casti Connubii, 1930, was an encyclical that responded to the Anglican Communion's Lambeth Conference, which had approved of the use of limited contraception. The Pope was concerned that it encouraged declining European birth rates and condemned contraception to be a grave sin. He advocated that sex's primary role is to reproduce, but approved of it having a secondary role in strengthening the intimacy for married couples. In 1921 to 1926, the Pope supported the malign conversation between Anglicans and Catholics. But in 1928, he wrote the encyclical Mortalium Animos, which opposed ecumenism, blaming it for relativism and so-called assumed equality between denominations, as well as indifference. Maximum Revissi Mehmet, 1924, the Pope desired French bishops to administer the diocese after the law of separations of 1905, but the French state still paid for the upkeep and gave the church use of its buildings. Action Francois was a Catholic pro-monarchist movement founded by Charles Mureș. Being anti-German, anti-Semitic, and having pagan ideas, some of his writings were placed in the Index of Forbidden Books. Charles Mureș was considered the spiritual father of fascism and corporatism. Cardinal Louis Bellour was sympathetic with the movement, but the Pope forced him to resign, which helped to mend the relationship between the Holy See and the Third Republic. Meanwhile, in British Malta, between 1927 and 1930, Mussolini and the Vatican desired Italian cultural influence over Malta. Lord Gerald Strickland was a Catholic British Maltese Prime Minister of Malta. He desired education to be taught in Maltese and English, which angered the clergy and religious orders who spoke in Italian. Archbishop Muro Caruana was told by the Pope to write a pastoral letter condemning the PM's actions and suggested that voting for him would be a mortal sin. The British government threatened a breakup of diplomatic relations between the Holy See. Gerald Strickland apologizes twice. However, the Pope refused, and despite the Pope's refusal, Caruana withdrew the pastoral letter, allowing Catholic Maltese to vote. Malta was an example of Italian cultural influence over the papacy. Meanwhile, in Mexico, Plutarco Elias Calles in 1924 enforced the anti-clerical separation of church and state in the Constitution of 1917. The bourgeois Hispanic class desired nationalism and sought to remove Catholic influence. This led to the Cristero Revolt, whereby Mexican rural peasants fought for tradition, religion, and their rights. The Mexican government killed many priests, like Jesuit priest Miguel Pro, who cried out "Viva Cristo Rey," long live Christ the King, right before his martyrdom. In 1929, peace negotiations were led by the United States influence between the Cristeros and the Mexican government. In his encyclical, in 1932, Acerba Animi, Pope condemns the heavy regulations of the church, which occurred after the revolt and subsequent negotiations. Also, anti-clericism was rife in places like Spain, which brought about Spanish abdication and the Spanish Civil War. The church and monarchy had close links with each other, and anarcho-syndicalists and socialists attacked this very relationship. In April of 1931, dictator Primo de Rivera resigns and King Alfonso XIII abdicates, causing the socialists to seize power. They declared Spain to be a republic and declared it to no longer be Catholic. In his encyclical on May of 1933, dialectissima nobis. The Pope counters this notion, and that the Church is not bound to any particular type of government, and also condemns the seizure of church property and education. Despite the Pope's stance on neutrality, the local church vehemently disliked the Spanish Republic. Anarcho-syndicalists attacked the clergy, rich and military, specifically between 1936 to 1937, burning churches, killing 13 bishops and 2,365 religious priests, 282 nuns, and 4,172 secular priests. In 1936, Francesco Franco launched a military uprising, which was supported by the local church. However, the Spanish Civil War was condemned by Pius as fratricidal carnage. Observatore Romano, on the 21st of October 1937, was an encyclical by the Pope who declared that the Church doesn't support either side of the conflict and that the Church was Armada. Meanwhile, in Portugal, 1926, the Republican military revolt and authoritarian Antonio Salazar took power. But being an academic, he liked papal social teaching and the Catholic Church, so things were alright in Portugal. Bolshevism and the Russian Civil War. The Bolsheviks declared a provisional government in 1917. Patriarch Tikhon of the Russian Orthodox Church requested assistance from the Pope after the deaths of 5 million in the Volga River area between 1921 to 1923. Papal relief missions were set up by Jesuit E.A. Walsh, who fed 158,000 per day by 1923 alone. Missions, however, were withdrawn by November as a result of show trials and the execution of Catholic and Orthodox lay and clergymen. The Pope secretly consecrated French Jesuit scholar Michel de Herbeny, 1926, to contact the underground church, consecrate new bishops, but this was caught by the Russian secret police. Quadragesimo anno 1936. Pius XI condemned socialism and communism, stating that no one can be a socialist and a good Catholic. Divinis Redemptoris, on the 19th of March 1937, claimed that communism was a pseudo-religion that uses terrorism and emphasizes and highlights the ideas of blind evolutionary forces, that it was anti-Christian and in opposition to God. The fear of communism led to Vatican sympathy for Germany, since the Nazis opposed Bolshevism. The Lande, or German states, lost control of education and faith matters, and these became centralized to the Reich, leading to the signing of concordats in Prussia, Baden-Baden, and Bavaria. The financial crash of the Great Depression between 1929 to 1932 caused 4.5 million Germans to become unemployed, brought about inflation, and the Nazis made use of the chaos to promote their own political agenda. Zentrumspartei of the Catholic Centre Party was in power between 1930 to 1932 under the direction of Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, who was a devout Catholic. In 1931, Brüning met in the Vatican with Pacelli, who convinced him to form a coalition or minority government with the Nazis as opposed to the Social Democrats. Brüning, however, saw the Nazis as untrustworthy. In 1933, Hitler took power and the Nazis became victorious. By the 4th of April, the Zentrumspartei was dissolved by Ludwig Haas, who became leader to his party and was convinced by Pacelli to give the Nazis supreme power, which led to the end of the Zentrumspartei. Reichskonkordat. On the 20th of July 1933, Pacelli and Franz von Papen of Germany negotiated for the protection of the institution of the German Church, but stopped the Church from speaking out against Nazi brutality. Nitzbrennen Sorge, or With Burning Anxiety, 1937, was an encyclical written by the Pope that condemned the Third Reich for not fulfilling the Concordat terms for creating a national god and fostering neo-paganism. This encyclical was smuggled into all German churches to be read by Palm Sunday. The Pope finally realized of the truth of Nazi oppression, telling Belgian pilgrims in September that spiritually we are Semites, and unsuccessfully tried to convince Australia and Canada to take in more Jewish immigrants. He wrote the encyclical Humanae Generis Unitas, Unity of the Human Race. However, the encyclical was drafted in secret in late 1938 to condemn anti-Semitism and racism, but Pius XI died on the 10th of February 1939. His successors shelved the encyclical into the secret archives. And yeah, ultimately, thanks for watching, and next time I will be covering Pope Pius XII and how he dealt with the Second World War.